Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrew Stott and I'm the Emperor of Stameria. Today we're continuing our series on how to start a nation by discussing how to name your nation. Historically speaking, the origins for the names of dynasties, of nations, of empires varies greatly. You have Rome, that was named after the mythical founder Romulus. You have the Ottoman Empire, that was named after its own founder, Osman I. You have England, which was named after the Angles, one of the Germanic tribes that came and invaded mainland Britain, which eventually became England after the Romans departed. You have Austria, the name of which is derived from a German word meaning Eastern Realm. Or my personal favourite is America, which is actually named after an Italian explorer, which I didn't actually know about until I made this video, called Amerigo Vespucci. And it is a particular interest of mine, this particular name, because of all the millions of people that lived in the Americas for tens of thousands of years before Europeans arrived, for all of the history, the culture, the identities that they built, for all the names of the lands that they had called their home for countless generations, for all of that, we decided that because this Italian gentleman poked around the Americas for a couple of years, that we just name it after him. And I think that's just breathtaking in some ways. And I also think it's interesting because in another alternate universe, these proud flag-waving American first patriots are not called Americans, they're called Vespuccians or something to that effect. And I think that's quite interesting because, you know, just the flip of a coin or the roll of the dice, had it just gone a little bit another way, the entire continent of North America and the entire continent of South America could have been called North and South Vespucci or Vespuccia or something to that effect. And I think that's just an interesting thing to think about. So with all of that said, you can see that there are various ways in which you can go about naming your nation. You can name it after the founder of the nation. You can name it after a geographical location if you wish. In fact, you can even go as far as naming it after a random explorer of your territory if that's the route you want to go down. But you do nevertheless want to make sure that the name that you choose is impactful, is memorable, and actually means something to you personally or to the community that you're looking to establish. And I think that's perhaps the most important thing to consider going forward, because even though that you can go down any of these routes, each of them does have a potential problem or a pitfall that you want to consider. For instance, naming the nation after yourself can give off the wrong impression. It can give off the wrong vibe. And even though I'm not going to give any examples of this, there are particular names out there, I think, that aren't particularly workable or usable when trying to establish the names of a nation or of a community. And I think one way around this, and some people have gone about doing this in the past, is trying to merge their name with another word. It might be someone else's name, their partner, for instance, or it could be a Latin phrase or a Latin word that they've sort of amalgamated along with their own name to create the name of their nation. That is one way to get around it. So you kind of fuse your own name with some other word or some other phrase that is in some way relevant to you. And that's just one aspect to think about when naming the nation after yourself. Because as I say, you don't want to give off the wrong impression, you don't want to give off the wrong vibe, and you want to make sure that the name is, objectively speaking, going to be something that is appealing and makes sense and stands out in a good way. If you're looking to name your nation after a geographical location, you really want to think carefully about that, because there are a number of problems that are accompanied by trying to name your nation after a geographical location, and it ultimately stems from the same problem, in that the geography and the environment that you're in will eventually change. Whether it's by you or by some other force, the world around you will change, so you have to consider that carefully. And a good hypothetical example of this would be if you purchase some land, and that land consisted of rolling hills with wheats and barleys on them, and when the sun hit it just right, it looked like it was just pure gold, and you decided to establish the Kingdom of the Golden Hills to match that, to emulate that, to tie the land to the name. What happens if that is no longer the case in the months or years ahead? Let's say, for instance, you decide to develop the land. Let's say you decide to plant trees and establish new forests. Let's say you want to put in dwellings. Let's say you want to scrap the idea of having wheats and barleys at all and focus on other produce. Suddenly the name the Kingdom of the Golden Hills doesn't really make as much sense as it used to. In another hypothetical situation, same kingdom, same situation, but because of the nature of these aspirant nations that we are looking to establish, the territory is quite fluid, in the sense that you could just sell the land and buy a plot elsewhere, hypothetically. And if that is the case, then the geography and the environment has changed utterly and completely. You're in a different part of the world, and suddenly the name Kingdom of the Golden Hills might not have any relevance whatsoever. So that is just something to think about going forward, because in all of this, no matter what you do with your name, no matter how you go about choosing a name, consistency is key. And I will get onto this in a minute in more detail, but the idea that you keep changing your name to reflect the environment that you're in is not going to be a good look, because people will not know who you are. People will not know how to follow you. People will become attached to a particular name and will want to keep it. So the name that you have, I think, wants to be quite all-encompassing. And finally, of course, if you do want to name your nation after some random guy that's popped onto your land and had a little nose round, feel free to do that if you want. I don't think it will be particularly relevant to yourself personally or to your community. But if that's the way you want to name your nation, then that's obviously an option too. Something I would recommend not doing, though, is using, for instance, a random name generator. You might want to use it to try to inspire some inspiration. That's certainly a route that we ourselves went down at one point, to see if we can sort of spark an inspiration, see if we can figure something out. That's not a route we went down ourselves in the end, but just in terms of using a random name generator to come up with a name and then just going, yep, that's our name now, on to the next issue. That is not a good way to go about it. And the reason for this is very simple. If you cannot be bothered to think about this, if you, as important an issue as the name of your nation, if you're not willing to give time and energy to consider this carefully, then why should anyone else bother getting involved in your nation? If you don't take it seriously, if you can't be bothered, then why should anyone else? So you want to really think about this, because it is a very important aspect of this nation building process. It is a part of your identity. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, and I will mention again later, it is crucial that when you choose a name, you stick with that name, because chopping and changing every time that there is some sort of change to your government institutions, to your government's ideology, to the location in which you're based, it doesn't inspire confidence. It creates doubt. And that is not something that you want. Now, the name Stameria is actually derived from an RTS game called Empire Earth, because ultimately it was this game in the early 2000s that eventually inspired the establishment, the creation, the formation of Stameria and the empire it would go on to build. And the reason for this is that when myself and my siblings were younger, we would play this game, and it was a civilization building game. So you would build dwellings and cities and civilizations, and then you would sort of build armies and battle your opponents. You would collect resources, engage in trade and all that sort of thing. A proper civilization building game. Quite primitive by today's standards, but nevertheless a game that I very much enjoyed playing when I was younger, as did my siblings. But we took all of those ideas at the time and we applied them to the real world. We'd go outside and we would build these forts, and we would build these dwellings, and we would invite our friends over, and we'd form these armies and have these battles. We had a system of taxation. We tried to build an agrarian economy, and it was really something. And even though it's not a direct link, if you like, it doesn't lead on from there and then all the way up to where we are now. There was a sort of 20-year gap, give or take, where nothing really happened. But nevertheless, it is something that eventually inspired me to establish Stameria, and the name actually comes from the citizens of the Copper Epic, because the way Empire Earth is structured, the way it works, is that you have different ages, epics, in which you go from Stone Age to the Copper to Bronze to Dark to Middle Ages, all the way up to sort of the future, to digital to nano. And in the Copper Ages, in the Copper Epics, if you give the citizens a command, they will actually respond occasionally by saying Stoma.
Kalas, Stoma. Carlos, Stoma.
And that is where the name Stameria comes from. And as humble an origin story as that is the inspiration for what we are doing. It is relevant to me, it is important to me, and I am obviously the founder of Stameria. And so that is why we ran with that, because it doesn't really matter how you go about naming your nation, as long as it's relevant to you, as long as it's impactful, as long as it has some sort of meaning in history. That is ultimately what is important. And I think it is better to do it this way, to find out what inspired you to establish a nation or a community. What is the driving force or driving purpose of your nation? If you can try to piece together a name from that, I think that is preferable to naming it after the founder or naming it after a geographical location or some random explorer or using a random name generator. I think the best way to go about doing it is thinking, well, what is the reason for me doing this? Why am I doing this? What is the inspiration? And then just trying to find a way to build a name from that. So one of the final aspects of naming your nation that I want to talk about is the prefix that you use. So for instance, a lot of nations around the world will be called the Republic of so-and-so or the Kingdom of so-and-so. And so the prefix that you choose will obviously be reflective of your government structure. This isn't always the case. Sometimes it will be the Dominion of so-and-so or the state of so-and-so, and it won't give you like a specific detail as to how that government is structured. But I think it is best, if you can, to have a prefix that identifies the structure of your nation, because it will help to identify for a lot of people the kind of nation that you are building. Now, interestingly, Stameria doesn't have a prefix, in the sense that the nation of Stameria is simply just called Stameria. And having done a little bit of research into this, out of the sort of 200 or so countries there are in the world, there are about between 15 and 20 that don't have a prefix. Now, initially when I did this research, I always assumed, and I don't know why I assumed this, but I always assumed that the likes of Canada and Australia, they didn't have a prefix. Because, take Canada for instance, I knew it wasn't a republic, it wasn't a kingdom, so I assumed it was just called Canada. But it isn't. It's called the Dominion of Canada, and same with Australia. It's called the Commonwealth of Australia. And I didn't actually know this until now. So I sort of advertised my ignorance on that front. But what I did learn is that nations which I did think had a prefix actually don't. Now, the reason for this is, well, many, but the one that always stuck out was Japan. I always assumed, even up until just before making this video, that Japan was called the Empire of Japan. And the reason for this is because Japan obviously is the last nation in the world, the last sovereign nation that has an internationally recognized emperor. And so it just made sense to me. The Emperor of Japan is the Emperor of the Empire of Japan. But it's not. It's simply called Japan. And this is interesting for me because this is pretty much exactly what we have in Stameria. It is just called Stameria. I am the Emperor of Stameria, but the Empire of Stameria only exists because of the other member states that make up the Empire of Stomaria. And I have made a video about this relatively recently, in that the nation of Stameria is its own thing. The Empire of Stameria is Stameria plus the member states of the Empire. As implied, it's the Empire of Stameria, not Stameria itself. But I am nevertheless the Emperor of Stameria and the Emperor of the Empire of Stameria. So it's a bit of a weird one on that front. And even though that I am encouraging people to have a prefix, because I think it is quite helpful in people identifying the kind of nation that you're trying to establish, as I say, it's not necessary and it's not essential. Because there are, as I say, 15 or 20 nations out there that don't have a prefix. And it's not just like small nations. It's Japan, it's Mongolia, it's Ukraine, it's Romania. These are all nations without a prefix. So it's not essential, but you know, I think it will be worthwhile for people to consider. And with all of that said, the thing that I would stress the most, and something I have touched upon already, is that when you are establishing a name for your nation and a name for your community, think about it carefully. Take time to consider the implications of what you are calling it. And then once you have settled on it and publicized it and advertised yourself as the Republic of so-and-so or the Kingdom of so-and-so, or simply, the name of your nation without a prefix, stick with it. Because if you chop and change, it breeds concern and inconsistency. People will not be inclined to get involved if they're not sure what they're getting involved in. So if you change from a republic to a kingdom, to an empire, to a principality, back to a republic, to a communist utopia, or whatever else, or dystopia as I would call it, then people just aren't going to trust the reliability of that nation. So be consistent, be reliable, build a brand. And that is ultimately what you should take away from this. No matter which route you go down, just make sure that the brand that you are building is something that you can establish and build upon over time. Do not chop and change, because if you do, people will simply lose faith in your ability to pick a direction and stick with it. So while I hope you've enjoyed this video, if you did want to become a part of the Stomarian community, then feel free to do so through our Patreon campaign, the link of which I shall leave in the description below as always. But otherwise, if you did enjoy the video, then please feel free to give it a like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll catch you in the next one.